Hi, I'm Pam Fox at pamfox.org and Quasi Yoga with Pam Fox here on Facebook. So tonight I'm going to be making dinner, and we're back in my kitchen, and I'm going to be making this dish that I talked about last week. This is the pesto carrot noodles with white beans and tomatoes. Here's a picture. I know that doesn't sound like anything amazing, but let's make it and I'll try it and I'll be honest with you guys whether or not it's good. So I happen to love pesto, and so I don't think you can go wrong with pesto. If this doesn't turn out that great, I can always just make some pasta and have the pesto on the pasta. So I still remember the first time I ever tried pesto. It was actually on my honeymoon from my first marriage. And I asked the waitress, what's this pesto? And she told me about it and she brought it out, and I have been a huge fan ever since. So traditionally, pesto has your basil, maybe some pine nuts, some olive oil, some Parmesan cheese, and some garlic. So this pesto recipe has a lot of that, but not all of that. It doesn't have the cheese, and it doesn't have the oil. So, but I have made a recipe very similar to this before, and I think it's really, really, really good. You still have, you know, the flavor from the garlic and the basil, so that's the primary flavor. I know the cheese adds a lot as well, but this has nutritional yeast in it, which has a cheesy flavor, so it adds that cheesy flavor. So let's try it and see what happens. The first thing I'm going to get going, I should have done this before we started, but I'm going to get a pot of water going. Actually, I've got a pot right here. And the noodles are carrots. So instead of pasta, it uses carrots. And I don't know how many of you have ever had, like, I talked about this last week, stacking things here. I talked about zoodles. I don't know how many of you have ever had zoodles. But it's where you take zucchini and you put it through a spiralizer, and the zucchini comes out, looks like noodles. And I don't have a spiralizer. Well, I do, but and I've never made zoodles, but I had them at a restaurant once, and I didn't think I would like them, and they were delicious. I think they were in like some type of a peanut butter garlic sauce, and they were amazing. They were so good. So I need to get a spiralizer so that I can make those zoodles. But you can also do this with carrots. You can make noodles out of carrots by putting them through a spiralizer. So a spiralizer, at least the cool kind of spiralizer, is this machine where you put the food in and then you crank it. I don't know if they have one that's power operated, but you crank it and then the noodles or the carrots come out the other side. Well, I bought this at Fred Meyer, and I'm here to tell you to don't buy one of these because they're really not worth the $14 or whatever I paid for them. You put your vegetable in, you put your vegetable in and you turn it, and I'll show you. I'll try to show you. And then the little noodles come out the other end. So, I mean, how labor intense is this? It would be here all night. So I'm not going to do that, and this will go in the Goodwill box. Hi, Araminta! You love zoodles? They are really good. The first time I ever saw it was watching Fully Raw Christina on YouTube make them. And she just acted like they were the most delicious thing ever, and I'm just going, I don't think so. That does not look appetizing. And of course she made this beautiful sauce to go on it. And she made a bowl like this big, and that was her meal because she eats raw. Hi, Kaylin. Hey, long time no see. Well, we'll see. But anyway, I didn't think that looked good at all. But I had them at a restaurant, and they are so good. Araminta, do you have a spiralizer? So what I'm opting to do is I'm using my husband's, I don't know, what do you call this thing? You guys know what this is? You put the, I'm sorry you guys can't see what I'm doing. I'm not set up very professionally, but here comes these little kind of thin sliced, what do you call this thing? Carrots that I'm just going to quickly steam, and that's going to be my noodles. So to do this, you just put the vegetable on, and then you, and it's kind of nice because it makes them all exactly the same size. They're all exactly the same width. So this recipe calls for 4 carrots. So I already started with that, you guys. So I've got my carrots here. And this is just a little piece that wouldn't go through this gadget, whatever. What is that thing called? If my husband was here, he could tell us. Somebody's going to help me out. Okay, so I'm just cutting up the little piece of carrot that didn't go through there. And so this is my pasta. I guess it's more like a fettuccine maybe. So this is going to go in the water. I don't want to forget about it because I just want to, so I'm going to set the timer for like 2 minutes. Just want to barely cook those. Okay, so we're going to move on to the sauce, and this won't take any time at all because I have my food processor here. So this recipe calls for 3 cups of basil leaves. So I've got 3 cups of basil leaves here, and this is really nice because at Fred Meyer they sell this size basil, which is 4 ounces, and it's exactly about 3 cups. So that's going to go into the food processor. I don't know about this. My food processor is on the smaller side, but I think it'll fit. And then a 1/3 cup of almonds or walnuts, and I picked up some. I'm just going to turn this off because I think I don't want to overcook those carrots, those noodles. So when I'm doing a recipe like this, a lot of times I keep walnuts in my freezer, but I'm out, and right now they're really expensive, so I just got a 1/3 cup of walnuts at my local bulk section at Fred Meyer, and that goes in. Let's see, 3 cloves of garlic. So between the basil and the nuts and the garlic, this is going to make a really delicious sauce. Sometimes I find when I eat raw garlic, it can kind of give me, I don't know, kind of an upset stomach. But when I process it like this in a sauce, and especially if I make it like a day in advance, then I don't seem to have a problem with it. Here's my timer. Okay, so there's the 3 cloves of garlic. And then this calls for miso. So this is a staple on a plant-based diet. This calls for white miso, but my local grocery store only carries red miso. That's okay, it's good. And miso is a fermented, this is an organic fermented soybean. And this calls for 1 teaspoon. And really it just adds a lot of salty flavor. It's got a salty flavor. So basil nuts, okay, nutritional yeast, 2 tablespoons. Again, I like the Bragg's brand. And it's kind of smells like Cheetos. Okay, 2 tablespoons of that. And I think that's it. And then for liquid, and it does call for a little bit of black pepper, so we'll put that in there. And then for liquid, to make this blendable, normally when you make a pesto, you stream in your olive oil, right? So instead of that, we use vegetable broth. And for vegetable broth, this is a homemade vegetable broth. The recipe is actually in this cookbook, the Dr. Michael Greger cookbook. I'm going to dump these noodles out because I don't want them to overcook. I don't want mushy carrot noodles. And I'm going to go ahead, so this recipe calls for, it calls for a can, 1.5 cups cooked PBA-free can, salt-free cannellini beans, and these are just a white northern bean, which looks like a cannellini bean. I'm just dumping those into that pot that I just cooked the carrots in to kind of heat those through. I think this will be a really good cold dish in the summer. So how's our pesto doing? So I need to add a little bit of the vegetable broth to this. And again, this recipe is in the Dr. Michael Greger How Not to Die cookbook. I'm going to turn this back on. This recipe also calls for cherry tomatoes. 1 cup of cherry tomatoes halved, which I haven't done yet, so I'll do that really quick while that's blending. I think that's ready to, I think it's done. I like it smooth though, so I'm going to let it rip a little bit longer. This smells really, really good. So you guys stick around because when I'm done, I'm going to try this and I'm going to tell you how it tastes. And then I'm going to read from the cookbook. So we've been talking about our country's #1 killers. Pesto. It's good. It's very, very good. So there's a little walnut that got stuck up in there. That's okay. So what I found, having been on a plant-based diet now for quite some time, is that when I eat foods that are really oily, so if I go to a restaurant and order like a pizza with a pesto sauce on it, like that oiliness that I used to really not even notice now kind of bothers me since I don't cook with oil. I rarely cook with oil. Okay, so there's our pesto. And it looks like regular pesto. I don't know if you can see that. It looks like regular. And it's good. It's good. So I just kind of dumped my beans in this hot pot. I'm not really heating them through, but I'm going to dump my carrots on top of that. So this is going to be kind of a warm dish tonight because the pot is hot and it's just going to kind of all mix together. I'm going to put my halved cherry tomatoes in there. And I think that's it. This calls for nutty parm, which is a homemade Parmesan cheese that's in the cookbook, but I didn't make any. So I'm going to just ladle some of this on there and give it a stir. So here's what we have. We've got the beans, the carrots, the tomatoes, and the pesto. Is that everything? Yeah, that's everything. So I'm just going to give this kind of a stir. And then we'll eat it. So again, I think this would be really good chilled as a summer salad. This is really different. This is just something very different. If you're trying to lose weight and trying to eat dishes that are satisfying, you know, and filling, this recipe, I mean, almost every recipe has beans in it. Dr. Michael Greger is really into beans, but that's because there's so much strong evidence that tells us, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we read tonight's chapter. It's a couple paragraphs. Talks a little bit about the benefits of beans. Okay, so here we go. You guys see that? I really need to start taking pictures of this to put on my Instagram page. I forget every time. There it is. There's your carrot noodles with beans and tomatoes and pesto. All right, here we go. I didn't get any carrot. That pesto is spot on. I could use a little salt. I didn't put any salt in it. The miso adds a salty flavor, but I like salty foods. I really like the beans and the tomatoes with the pesto. I'm going to be honest though, this will be better with real pasta. It would be amazing with real pasta. But I mean, it's really good. It's different. It's definitely delicious. I think a lot of times, like when we eat certain foods or any foods, like we have a certain expectation for things to be a certain way. And then when they're different, they kind of don't meet our expectations. But if you stop and ask yourself, like, well, is it tasty? It's definitely beautiful. Beautiful presentation, color. It's not as good as Zoodles. I think with a little salt to this, I'm going to really like it. Okay, so I will finish this later. That's probably not a dish that'll go into my repertoire of menus that I repeat, but it was good. It was good. So, so we've been talking about our country's #1 killers, and we started with coronary artery disease, and then we moved on to the #2 killer, which is lung diseases. And he talks, you know, in depth about all these things in his actual book, How Not to Die. This is the How Not to Die cookbook, where the introduction just does a little bit of a summary. I'm going to turn my heater off. Hang on just a second. I always crank up the heat when I come home from work. You're having technical problems. How so, Kaylin? Oh, how so? Oh, okay. Well, how so? I'm not sure what that means. So he talks more about these in his other book, and here he just kind of he just touches on them. So we talked about coronary artery disease, lung disease, and tonight we're going to talk about brain disease. And again, he goes into a lot of depth in his actual book about the scope, the broadness of brain disease. But in these couple of paragraphs, he focuses in on Alzheimer's and dementia, which many of you don't need me to tell you that it's a horrible, horrible disease that not only, you know, affects the person who has the disease, but it really affects everyone that loves that person. The two most serious brain diseases are stroke and Alzheimer's, which collectively kill 215,000 Americans each year. Both have touched my life. My mom's father died of a stroke and her mother of Alzheimer's. With most strokes, blood flow to the brain is cut off, depriving it of oxygen. The consequences wrought by a stroke depend on which area of the brain was damaged. People who experience a brief stroke might only need to contend with an arm or leg weakness, whereas those who suffer a major stroke can be struck with paralysis, lose the ability to speak, or, as is too often the case, die. Fortunately, a plant-based diet may reduce the odds of a stroke. Increasing intake of fiber, which is found only in plants, by only 7 grams per day, that's about a cup of raspberries, is associated with a 7% risk in reduction. In addition, a meta-analysis in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology found that increasing your potassium intake by 1,640 milligrams, a cup of cooked greens or a half a cup of beans, was associated with a 21% reduction in stroke risk. Your video keeps kicking you off. Just thought I'd let I have technical problems like that all the time, Kaylin. I'm sorry to hear it. I'm glad you're here, though. I just saw Kaylin like a couple hours ago. Alzheimer's, a horrendous disease that destroys our memory and sense of self, can neither be cured nor treated effectively. However, there is an emerging consensus that the same foods that clog our arteries can also clog our brain. A senior scientist at the Center for Alzheimer's Research. Resume. Okay. All right, we're still live. A senior scientist at the Center for Alzheimer's Research entitled a review article, Alzheimer's disease is incurable but preventable. Autopsies have shown repeatedly that Alzheimer's patients tend to have significantly more atherosclerotic plaque buildup and narrowing of the arteries within the brain. Numerous studies have shown that Alzheimer's is not a primarily genetic disease. For example, Alzheimer's rates among Japanese men living in the United States are much higher than those of Japanese men living in Japan. The same goes for African Americans in Indianapolis compared to Africans in Nigeria. The problem may be the typical American diet, which can choke the arteries within the brain. Where is the world's lowest validated rate of Alzheimer's? Rural northern India, where people traditionally eat a plant-based diet centered on grains and vegetables. So he touches on this idea that that it's the fat in the diet, a diet high in dietary fat. So when you're on the, a standard American diet, you're eating a lot of animal foods. That's a lot of fat. And so I like to think about this, when we think about fat internally, I like to visualize the fat. Like when I go to, when I make a smoothie in the morning and I go to clean my Vitamix, I just rinse it with water. I don't even need soap to clean out that plant material. But what happens when you cook a dinner like ground beef or a pot roast, and you go to clean those pots and pans? We hate to clean those pots and pans. You can't just rinse them with water, right? Because that fat sticks around, and it does the same thing in the body. I remember when I was a kid, well, not just when I was a kid, but when I was living at home with my parents, my dad would, oh my gosh, we were not allowed to put any fat down the kitchen sink because it would clog the pipes, and he'd have to crawl under the house to find the clog and to clean it out. And so we weren't allowed to put any kind of oil down the kitchen sink. It had to go in the garbage. And it's the same thing internally. So we know that, our arteries can get clogged, and that blocks the flow, to the body, to the systems, to the heart. We know that intestines, we get intestinal blocks. We get, and he's talking about here about flow to the brain. And so in his book, How Not to Die, he talks a lot about brain illness, the broad spectrum of brain illness, from depression to anxiety and all the way up to, dementias and Alzheimer's. And, the needs of the brain. We need to meet the needs of the brain. And I know that personally, I've suffered with depression off and on most of my adult life. And not just because, of a bad circumstances. I've suffered with depression for absolutely no reason. And I know that depression is, and brain illnesses, that, there's a wide variety of contributors to those diseases. But I personally believe that if doctors were quicker to address the nutrition when it comes to their patients with brain illness, we would see a lot more improvement in these illnesses, because the brain requires oxygen. And so if you're cutting off flow, that's going to be an issue. It requires glucose. It almost completely relies on glucose. And what is glucose? Well, it's sugar, it's carbohydrate. And on a plant-based diet, you're eating plants, which all have carbohydrate in them. And so you're meeting the needs of your brain as long as you're eating a diet that is, plentiful. You're eating plenty of food. You're not starving yourself. You're eating plenty of beautiful whole plant foods. And so you're meeting the needs of your brain by giving it the nutrition that it needs, the glucose that it needs. So when we live a lifetime of, starving our brain essentially by going on some of these, low carb, all these low carb diets that are so popular. And I'm not talking about candy bars and donuts. I mean, certainly you should eliminate those from your diet, but I'm talking about, people who go on a low carb diet and they eliminate grains and they eliminate beans and they eliminate fruits because they're on a low carb diet. And, our body's number one preferred fuel source is glucose. And again, our brain relies almost exclusively on glucose. So when you cut back on these essential carbohydrates, then the body starts to speak to you. It starts to, just like it does anytime that there's an issue. It starts to speak to us and lets us know through symptoms, through pain, through discomfort, through, all sorts of, symptoms. And then most of us are really quick to say, oh, I have this issue, I need to go to the doctor, and I need to take a pill. And that's where, like I said before, it's really unfortunate that more doctors, and I know many of them do, but it's really unfortunate that more doctors aren't saying, let's look at the food first. Before we, turn to pharmaceuticals, before we turn to surgery, let's take a look at the food. And so that is my mission here, is to inspire you to think more about what it is that you're eating, what it is that you're putting in your mouth, because all of that food goes internally and it can damage your internal system if it's too much saturated fat, if it's too much chemicals. Okay? So I would just encourage you, to consider the plants. Please consider the plants. All right? Let's see. There was one other thing I wanted to talk about, but it skipped my mind. So I think I'm going to finish my dinner, and that's that. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a great night. Bye, Kaylin, if you stuck around.